From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I'm the only one on the stage who's gotten anything really big done.
You got the disastrous war in Iraq done. You got a bankruptcy bill which is hurting middle-class families all over this country. You got trade agreements like NAFTA and PNTR with China done, which have cost us 4 million jobs.
12 Democratic presidential candidates faced off on the Middle East: guns, reproductive rights, impeachment, taxing the rich, health care, and more at a debate in Ohio. Senator Elizabeth Warren, now leading in some national polls, repeatedly came under attack from her rivals.
Medicare for all is the gold standard. It is the way we get health care coverage for every single American, including the family whose child's been diagnosed with cancer, including the person who's just gotten an MS diagnosis.
And I appreciate Elizabeth's work. But again, the difference between a plan and a pipe dream is something that you can actually get done.
We'll air highlights from the debate and host a roundtable discussion. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 12 candidates took to the stage for the fourth round of Democratic presidential debate in Westerville, Ohio, Tuesday to spar over health care, foreign policy, impeachment, gun violence, reproductive rights, and economic inequality. CNN and New York Times moderators failed to ask a single question about the climate crisis or immigration. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's now leading some national polls, repeatedly came under attack from her rivals. This is Warren on President Trump's withdrawal of troops from northern Syria and Turkey's ongoing deadly air and ground assault in the region.
So, look, I think that we ought to get out of the Middle East. I don't think we should have troops in the Middle East, but we have to do it the right way, the smart way. What this president has done is that he has sucked up to dictators. He has made impulsive decisions that often his own team doesn't understand. He has cut and run on our allies, and he has enriched himself at the expense of the United States of America. In Syria, he has created a bigger than ever humanitarian crisis. He has helped ISIS get another foothold, a new lease on life.
Warren was responding to Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard saying the U.S. should leave the Middle East. Former Vice President Joe Biden faced questioning about his son Hunter's dealings in Ukraine and claimed he and his son did nothing wrong amidst ongoing impeachment proceedings against President Trump. And Bernie Sanders called for a Green New Deal, Medicare for all, and defended his plan to tax the rich.
When you have 500,000 Americans sleeping out on the street today, when you have 87 million people uninsured or underinsured, when you got hundreds of thousands of kids who cannot afford to go to college and millions struggling with the oppressive burden of student debt, and then you also have 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom half of American society, that is a moral and economic outrage.
Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar announced Tuesday she's endorsing Sanders in his bid for the presidency. Congressmembers Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib are also expected to announce their support for the Vermont senator. He's holding a large rally in Queens, New York this weekend. We'll spend the hour on the presidential debate after headlines. Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo are heading to Turkey today as the Turkish offensive into Kurdish-controlled areas of northern Syria continues. The ground offensive began after President Trump withdrew U.S. troops stationed in the area, clearing the way for the assault. Now Pence and Pompeo are hoping to meet with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan to persuade him to stop the military campaign. This morning, Erdogan vowed he would not declare a ceasefire and would probably not meet with the U.S. envoys. He's headed to Russia to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the coming days. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports a second second reporter has died covering the conflict. Syrian Kurdish reporter Mohammed Hussein Rasho died from injuries sustained in a Turkish airstrike on a civilian convoy, which also killed another journalist, Syrian Kurdish reporter Saad Ahmed. Humanitarian aid organizations, including Doctors Without Borders, say they're being forced to suspend their operations in northern Syria amidst the ongoing fighting, which has already forced more than 100,000 people to flee the area, including even Mohammed.
We are coming here, but our families and relatives have not come yet, and their conditions are very bad. Some of them are sick, and some others are elderly people. We call upon President Assad to open the crossing borders so that the patients can come.
The U.S. Justice Department filed fraud and money laundering charges against Turkey's second-largest state-owned bank, accusing Halkbank of helping Iran evade U.S. sanctions. The indictment comes after the U.S. also announced sanctions against Turkey over its offensive in Syria. In news from the ongoing impeachment inquiry, the senior State Department official in charge of Ukraine policy, George Kent, told House committee lawmakers Tuesday he was sidelined from his job by the Three Amigos, U.S. ambassador to the European Union, the hotelier and real estate developer Gordon Sondland, special envoy for Ukraine Kurt Volker, and energy secretary Rick Perry. These three worked with Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, on the effort to pressure Ukraine to investigate Trump's political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. The Washington Post reports acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney told White House staff members that it was legal to block the nearly $400 million in funds to Ukraine. In a July phone call, President Trump mentioned the U.S. funding to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and then asked for a favor. Meanwhile, a federal grand jury in New York has subpoenaed former Texas Congressmember Pete Sessions for records and information about his interactions with Giuliani and his two associates who were just arrested at Dulles Airport trying to board a one-way flight to Vienna and were charged with campaign finance violations. Reportedly, if they had made it to Vienna, they were meeting once again with Rudolph Giuliani. In more news from Capitol Hill, 18 leaders from human rights and faith organizations were arrested in the civil disobedience action protesting the Trump administration's efforts to gut the refugee resettlement program. Last month, the administration proposed accepting only 18,000 refugees over the next year. That's down from the 110,000-person limit set by President Obama during his final year in office. Tuesday's arrests on Capitol Hill came as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was meeting privately with Congress members to discuss Trump's plan to cap the number of refugees admitted into the country at the lowest level since the program began 4 decades ago. In Pennsylvania, a British family has been held in immigration detention at the Berks Family Residential Center after they say they mistakenly drove across the U.S.-Canada border during a vacation in Vancouver. Eileen Connors and her family, including her 3-month-old son, were then taken into U.S. custody and transferred into detention, where they are waiting to be deported. In a sworn statement, Connors describes the conditions inside Berks as frigid and filthy and said, quote, "We will be traumatized for the rest of our lives by what the United States government has done to us. We have been treated like criminals here, stripped of our rights, and lied to," she said. To see our full coverage of the Berks Detention Center, go to democracynow.org. Human rights organizations are condemning the Egyptian government for the detention and torture of journalist and human rights activist Esra Abdel Fattah. Egyptian security forces abducted her from her car at night on October 12th. She says she was then beaten and strangled by officers. She's one of at least 3,000 people who've been arrested since the rare protests against Egyptian leader Abdel Fattah el-Sisi late last month. In Lebanon, over 100 wildfires have swept across the country since Monday, burning forested areas and killing at least one person. Officials say the flames are fueled by a heat wave. Lebanon called for international help from neighboring countries to fight the fires, which officials are calling the worst fires to hit Lebanon in decades. In Mexico, the Senate is slated to vote on legislation to legalize marijuana in the coming days. The bill's passage would mark a major shift away from the U.S.-backed drug war in Mexico, which has killed tens of thousands of people since it began in 2006. This is Mexican Senator Ricardo Monreal, a member of the Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's Morena party.
La eliminación prohibicionista en el país es bueno.
Eliminating prohibition in the country is good. I think the possibility of regulating consumption, the cultivation, commercialization is a good thing. Also, heeding towards industrial use is also good. I think that Mexico is prepared to take on such a position, on such trajectory. There are voices like that of the president, who has said there should be a national consultation, which is under consideration, which is pending, and which is under discussion.
In Canada, a member of the Mohawk community in Ganassadage in southwestern Quebec has gone on a hunger strike amidst an escalating land struggle between the First Nations tribe and real estate developers. The residents are asking Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to implement a short-term moratorium on all development in their territory. Trudeau has promised reconciliation with Canada's First Nations. He's facing the possibility of being unseated in Canada's federal elections next week. This is Ellen Gabriel.
Because the government has been ignoring us for many generations, but in particular with this government that promised that we would be the most important relationship in Canada, and it wasn't. So a hunger strike to provide some light to this complex issue that the people in Ganassadage, the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people have been fighting for many, many generations.
Ganassadage is the site of the so-called Oka crisis in the 1990, when Mohawks had a 78-day standoff with Canadian armed forces, stopping the development of a golf course and condominiums on one of their burial grounds. In California, 2 fuel storage tanks exploded at a New Star Energy facility in Crockett. Outside San Francisco Tuesday, the fire burned for nearly 8 hours, shut down part of Interstate 80. New Star says it's investigating whether Monday's 4.5 magnitude earthquake nearby could have contributed to the explosion at the facility. MSNBC's Chris Hayes took aim at his own network in the closing minutes of his show All In with Chris Hayes Monday, praising Ronan Farrow's new book, Catch and Kill, which accuses NBC of burying Farrow's reporting on the serial rapist Harvey Weinstein. His book also accuses NBC executives of knowing about multiple sexual misconduct allegations against now-fired NBC host Matt Lauer, who's accused of raping fellow NBC producer Brooke Nevels in 2014, while the two covered the Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia. This is Chris Hayes.
My own news organization is embroiled in a very public controversy over its conduct. As you've probably seen in his new book, Catch and Kill, my former colleague Ronan Farrow contends that NBC News slow-walked and then ultimately killed his reporting on Harvey Weinstein's sexual harassment and assault because it was intimidated by Weinstein and didn't want to cross him. Most distressingly, Farrow suggests NBC News was worried about the allegations of sexual assault and harassment against Matt Lauer coming out as a result of reporting on Weinstein and desperately wanted to avoid that. One thing, though, is indisputable. Ronan Farrow walked out of NBC News after working on the Weinstein story and within 2 months published an incredible article, The New Yorker, that not only won a Pulitzer, but helped trigger a massive social and cultural reckoning that continues to this day. It is the kind of journalism that you want to do as a journalist.
That was Chris Hayes of MSNBC. And Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too campaign, is launching a new effort to mobilize 2020 voters. The new campaign's hashtag is MeTooVoter. aiming to pressure candidates to speak about sexual violence and harassment on the campaign trail. On Tuesday, Tarana Burke said, quote, "You can't have 12 million people respond to a hashtag in this country and they not be constituents, taxpayers, and voters. We need these candidates to see us as a power base. So many people engage with survivors from a place of pity," she said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. 12 candidates took to the stage for the fourth round of the Democratic presidential debate in Westerville, Ohio, Tuesday, to spar over health care, foreign policy, impeachment, gun violence, economic inequality, and more. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is now leading some national polls, repeatedly came under attack from her rivals over how she plans to pay for some of her plans, including Medicare for All. It was the first debate since Senator Bernie Sanders suffered a heart attack 2 weeks ago that forced him to temporarily cancel campaign events. On Tuesday night, CNN host Erin Burnett asked Senator Sanders about his health.
But there is a question on a lot of people's minds, and I want to address it tonight. You're 78 years old, and you just had a heart attack. How do you reassure Democratic voters that you're up to the stress of the presidency?
Well, let me invite you all to a major rally we're having in Queens, New York, BernieSanders.com. We're going to have a special guest at that event, and we are going to be mounting a vigorous campaign all over this country. That is how I think I can reassure the American people. But let me take this moment, if I might, to thank so many people from all over this country, including many of my colleagues up here, for their love, for their prayers, for their well wishes. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I'm so happy to be back here with you this evening.
On Tuesday, Minnesota Congressmember Ilhan Omar announced she is endorsing Sanders in his bid for the presidency. Congressmembers Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib are also expected to announce their support for the Vermont senator. AOC will be joining him at his rally in Queens this weekend. At Tuesday's debate, the Democratic candidates also took aim at President Trump's recent move to withdraw support from the Kurds in northern Syria, paving the way for Turkey to invade the region. Former House Secretary Julian Castro criticized Trump for letting former ISIS fighters escape from Kurdish-controlled jails.
You know, I also want people to think the folks this week that saw those images of ISIS prisoners running free, to think about how absurd it is that this president is caging kids on the border and effectively letting ISIS prisoners run free.
Meanwhile, former Vice President Joe Biden attacked the proposals of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. This is CNN's Anderson Cooper.
President Biden. Just on either side of you, Senator Warren is calling for big structural change. Senator Sanders is calling for a political revolution. Will their visions attract the kind of voters that the Democrats need to beat Donald Trump?
Well, I think their vision is attracting a lot of people. And I think a lot of what they have to say is really important. But, Senator Warren said we can't be running any vague campaigns. We got to level with people. We've got to level with people and tell them exactly what we're going to do, how we're going to get it done, and if you can get it done. I'm going to say something that is probably going to offend some people here, but I'm the only one on the stage who's gotten anything really big done, from the Violence Against Women Act to making sure that we passed the Affordable Care Act, to be in a position where we, in fact, took almost a $90 billion act that kept us from going into a depression, putting us in a position where I was able to end able to end the issue of gun sales in terms of assault weapons.
Just to clarify, Vice President, who are you saying is being vague?
Well, the senator said she's being vague on the issue of, actually both of them being vague on the issue of Medicare for all. No, look, here's the deal. Come on. It cost $30 trillion. Guess what? That's over $3 trillion a year. It's part of the entire federal budget. Let me finish, okay?
You'll both get in.
If you eliminated the entire Pentagon, every single thing, plane, ship, troop, the buildings, everything, satellites, it would pay for a total of 4 months. 4 months. Where do you get the rest? Where does it come from?
Two things.
Senator Sanders, respond.
In two ways. Joe, you talked about working with Republicans and getting things done. But you know what you also got done, and I say this as a good friend. You got the disastrous war in Iraq done. You got a bankruptcy bill, which is hurting middle-class families all over this country. You got trade agreements like NAFTA and PNTR with China done, which have cost us 4 million jobs. And let's get to Medicare for all. Let's be honest. We spend twice as much per person as do the people of any other major country on earth. And the answer is, if we have the guts, and I would like to see the Democratic Party have that guts, to stand up to the drug companies and the insurance companies and tell them that the function of health care is to guarantee care to all people, not to make $100 billion in profit. If we stood together, we could create the greatest health care system
Vice President Biden, you
in
can
the world.
respond, and then Senator Warren.
We can do that without Medicare for all. We can do that by adding a public option. We can.
No,
and we can afford to do it.
You got to take on the greed and the profiteering of the healthcare industry.
Senator Warren, your response.
So you started this question with how you got something done. You know, following the financial crash of 2008, I had an idea for a consumer agency that would keep giant banks from cheating people. And all of the Washington insiders and strategic geniuses said, don't even try, because you will never get it passed. And sure enough, the big banks fought us, the Republicans fought us, some of the Democrats fought us. But we got that agency passed into law. It has now forced big banks to return more than $12 billion directly to people they cheated. I served in the Obama administration. I know what we can do by executive authority, and I will use it. In Congress, on the first day, I will pass my anti-corruption bill, which will beat back the influence of money and repeal the filibuster. And the third, we want to get something done in America. We have to get out there and fight for the things that touch people's lives.
I agreed with, let me, she referenced me. I agreed with the great job she did. And I went on the floor and got you votes. I got votes for that bill. I convinced people to vote for it. So let's get those things straight, too.
Senator Warren, do you want to respond?
I am deeply grateful to President Obama, who fought so hard to make sure that agency was passed into law. And I am deeply grateful to every single person who fought for it and who helped pass it into law. But understand—
You did a hell of a job in your job.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. Well, for more, we'll host a roundtable in New York City. We're joined by journalist Kate Aronoff and Steffi Woolhandler, professor at CUNY Hunter College and a primary care physician. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Intercept senior contributor Mehdi Hasan, host of Deconstructed podcast. In Rochester, New York, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter David K. Johnston, founder and editor of DCReport.org. Mehdi Hasan, let's begin with you. Your overall impression of the debate, what you felt was most important, talked about and not.
Well, let's start with not, Amy. A 3-hour debate involving 12 candidates, and we didn't get a single question on the climate crisis, which threatens our future on this planet. We didn't get a single question on racist voter suppression, which threatens democracy in this country. We didn't get a single question on kids being abused and caged at the border, which is perhaps the single biggest human rights crisis in this country right now. We didn't get a single question on the war in Yemen, where the U.S. is directly involved in the killing of children, not indirectly as it is in Syria, which was talked about a lot. But we did get a question about Ellen and George W. Bush. So there was a lot missing from the debate. But what you just played there just now, well, I think was the most important part of the debate for me, because I've been astounded that Joe Biden has been considered a frontrunner in this Democratic presidential race so far. I hope after last night we can end this idea that he is a frontrunner. Elizabeth Warren went in as the new frontrunner. I think Biden has to be taken out of the top three. My colleague Ryan Grimm has talked about his sunsetting incoherence that we see on nights like this. Normally, he spends the first hour at least strong-ish and then fades over the course of the night in the previous 3 debates. Last night, he was weak from the get-go. He couldn't even answer a basic question about his son, which is the most important or biggest story in American politics right now. He rambled, he stuttered, he stumbled, he confused Secondly, he confused Iraq with Syria. He talked about abolishing the capital gains tax when he meant he wanted to raise it. And as you saw in that cringeworthy clip a moment ago, he shouted at and patronized Elizabeth Warren. I think it was a disastrous night for Biden. We saw Pete Buttigieg come out swinging, trying to take the Biden quote-unquote moderate mantle. But really, there should only be two frontrunners right now, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, both of whom were very strong last night. And it was a very good night for Bernie Sanders, who can believe that he had a heart attack only 2 weeks ago.
Well, Kate Aronoff, what's your biggest takeaway from this debate?
I mean, I think Mehdi really said it, right? There was no discussion about the climate crisis. Candidates, especially Bernie Sanders, kept trying to bring it up reliably in every question and work it into questions that, kept sort of ignoring this huge issue. And it's irresponsible. I mean, the New York Times and CNN should be ashamed of themselves, frankly, for doing this. We saw a few weeks ago, climate strikers are grade school children who are giving up their recesses, their lunches, everything to plan climate strikes because they know the Earth will be a very different place within their lifetimes. And the Earth already is a very different place for very many people. And the fact is that, the climate crisis is not an issue neatly defined. It is the terrain on which all politics in the 21st century will play out. And to ignore that fact when we have, discussion of such interrelated things as foreign policy is obscene. It's obscene. And the fact that, CNN, all of the major networks reliably run ad content from fossil fuel companies, including last night, or from climate-denying organizations, is just unconscionable, and they should, really sort of take stock of them.
And the issue of Hunter Biden, which the vice president was asked about early on in the debate, and he kept saying, "I'm proud of my son," but at the same time referring to his son's interview that same day where he was actually apologizing, saying he may have made some mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, this is sort of classic Biden not being able to keep a thought straight for 15 seconds. I think on the other hand, this is a real issue, right? Hunter Biden worked for a natural gas company in the Ukraine, and I think we can hold two things at once, right? You can believe that the impeachment process needs to go forward, that this is a valuable thing to be investigated, and that the president stepped out of line. You can also say that this is a shady thing and an electoral liability for Joe Biden in, a world in which just 4 years ago, the right sort of wielded Hillary Clinton's sort of consummate insider status, her position as being the sort of continuation of the Obama era against her so effectively.
Let's go to CNN's Anderson Cooper questioning Joe Biden about his son Hunter.
If it's not okay for a president's family to be involved in foreign businesses, why was it okay for your son when you were vice president? Vice President Biden?
Look, my son did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. I carried out the policy of the United States government in rooting out corruption in Ukraine. And that's what we should be focusing on. And what I wanted to make a point about, and my son's statement speaks for itself. He spoke about it today. My son's statement speaks for itself. What I think is important is we focus on why it's so important to remove this man from office.
Just a follow-up. Mr. Vice President, as you said, your son Hunter today gave an interview, admitted that he made a mistake and showed poor judgment by serving on that board in Ukraine. Did you make a mistake by letting him? You were the point person on Ukraine at the time, if you can answer.
Look, my son's statement speaks for itself. I did my job. I never discussed a single thing with my son about anything having to do with Ukraine. No one has indicated I have. We've always kept everything separate. Even when my son was the Attorney General of the state of Delaware, we never discussed anything. So there'd be no potential conflict. My son made a judgment. I'm proud of the judgment he made. I'm proud of what he had to say. And let's focus on this. The fact of the matter is that this is about Trump's corruption.
So that's Joe Biden defending his son Hunter. And, Kate, you wrote a piece in The Guardian. We need to talk about Hunter Biden.
Yeah, I mean, I think you heard it right there. I mean, the fact that Biden is sort of walking over himself to defend the conduct of his son, who was working for a natural gas company, and because his last name is Biden, right? There's no reason that he would have that job if he weren't related to Joe Biden. And the fact is that U.S. foreign policy has, and including in the Ukraine, has spent years and decades propping up fossil fuel interests and supporting fossil fuel interests, and that is a problem. And I think actually, it's a missed opportunity for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren to raise that. The fact that the reason Joe Biden was in the Ukraine, in large part, was to support the fossil fuel industry there that his son was, actively profiting off of.
I mean, I suppose they think it was it would get in the way of the impeachment message, which they all seem to agree with last night. But David K. Johnston, if you can talk about that issue of impeachment, they didn't disagree. Yes, Hunter Biden, but also Trump's children and how they're benefiting today.
Well, I think all of last night's debate showed that the Democrats, all 12 of them, have not thought well about how do you market to people. Donald Trump, the most corrupt president, the most incompetent president, a lifetime criminal, has persuaded tens of millions of Americans that he loves them and that he is working for them while he's actively working against them. The Democrats didn't reach out to those people and say, here's what we can do for you. And in the impeachment process, Congress has to impeach him. He's publicly declared that he's committed criminal acts. Whether he's convicted, we've yet to see. The Democrats should have been trying to move Republican senators, if anything, so that they have to vote to remove Donald Trump, which we know many of them want to do, except they're afraid they will be voted out in a primary. But in the arguments that were made last night in this debate, the Democrats on that panel did not very much talk about what we will do for you. Put us in office. You will no longer go broke if you get sick. We will raise wages for people in the bottom half in this country. We are going to improve your lot by building an economy that works for everybody. They talked in many cases in very abstract terms. Elizabeth Warren, who is highly qualified, in some cases went all professorial, and to many Americans, I'm sure her points came across as blah, 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 because she wasn't thinking in simple marketing terms.
Well, but David K. Johnson, on one issue, she was pretty specific on her wealth tax. She zeroed in on that, and interestingly, got a lot of pushback from Andrew Yang, who pointed to the fact that European governments have tried a wealth tax, and little by little, each of them, or most of them, have repealed that wealth tax. Could you talk about that wealth tax? Is it viable, or is it even constitutional?
Well, it's certainly constitutional. The original tax in this country was a wealth tax. It was a national property tax. The problem is that very, very wealthy people don't have their wealth in easily measured forms like stock portfolios. So lots of people will be able to easily evade a wealth tax. The idea that we're not properly taxing people at the top is absolutely spot on correct. So one of the first things the Democrats should have been saying is, when you die, we're not going to let you give away your entire fortune to your favorite charity and pay no tax. We're going to tax that money when you die, or a significant portion of it. And so I think Yang on that exact point is correct. But on the other hand, Bernie Sanders and especially Elizabeth Warren are exactly right. We are not taxing people at the top properly. We have cut the tax rate on people at the very top by more than half in the last 60 years. Well, for people in the bottom 90%, we've raised their taxes. That's crazy. As a result...
Let's go to CNN host Erin Burnett questioning Senator Bernie Sanders on this.
Senator Sanders, when you introduced your wealth tax, which would tax the assets of the wealthiest Americans, you said, quoting you, Senator, billionaires should not exist. Is the goal of your plan to tax billionaires out of existence?
When you have 500,000 Americans sleeping out on the street today, when you have 87 million people uninsured or underinsured, when you got hundreds of thousands of kids who cannot afford to go to college and millions struggling with the oppressive burden of student debt, and then you also have 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom half of American society. That is a moral and economic outrage. And the truth is, we cannot afford to continue this level of income and wealth inequality, and we cannot afford a billionaire class whose greed and corruption has been at war with the working families of this country for 45 years. So if you're asking me, do I think we should demand that the wealthy start paying, the wealthiest, top 0.1%, start paying their fair share of taxes so we can create a nation and a government that works for all of us? Yes, that's exactly what I believe.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Steyer, you are the lone billionaire on this stage. What's your plan for closing the income gap?
Well, first of all, let me say this. Senator Sanders is right. There have been 40 years where corporations have bought this government, and those 40 years have meant a 40-year attack on the rights of working people and specifically on organized labor. And the results are as shameful as Senator Sanders says, both in terms of assets and in terms of income. It's absolutely wrong. It's absolutely undemocratic and unfair. I was one of the first people on this stage to propose a wealth tax. I would undo every Republican tax cut for rich people and major corporations. But there's something else going on here that is absolutely shameful, and that's the way the money gets split up in terms of earnings. As a result of taking away the rights of working people in organized labor, people haven't had a raise. 90% of Americans have not had a raise for 40 years. If you took the minimum wage from 1980 and just adjusted it for inflation, you get $11. It's $7.25. If you included the productivity gains of American workers, it'd be over $20. There's something wrong here, and that is that the corporations have bought our government. Our government has failed. That's why I'm running for president, because we're not going to get any of the policies that everybody on this stage wants. Health care, education, Green New Deal, or a living wage, unless we break the power of these corporations.
Thank you, Mr. Steyer. Vice President Biden, you have warned against demonizing rich people. Do you believe that Senator Sanders and Senator Warren's wealth tax plans do that?
No, look, demonizing wealth people, what I talked about is how you get things done. And the way to get things done is take a look at the tax code right now. The idea we have to start rewarding work, not just wealth. I would eliminate the capital gains tax. I would raise the capital gains tax to the highest rate of 39.5%. I would double it. Because guess what? Why in God's name should someone who's clipping coupons in the stock market pay a lower tax rate than someone who, in fact, is, like I said, a school teacher and a firefighter? It's ridiculous, and they pay a lower tax.
That's Vice President Joe Biden, and before him, Tom Steyer, who has this is his first debate. Mehdi Hassan, a quick comment.
It was amusing to see the lone billionaire on stage saying Bernie Sanders is right about billionaires. And I would just say this very quickly to my good friend David K. Johnston. I get where he's coming from on the kind of Democratic Party messaging when it comes to things like income inequality and taxes and wealth. I do think, though, that Warren and Sanders were pretty clear. I think Warren is always very clear when she talks about her wealth tax, about sticking 2 cents on every extra dollar above the 50 millionth dollar. And I thought she had a very good line last night where she allied herself with Bernie Sanders. They've still got this non-aggression pact where she said, Bernie and we stand for a wealth tax, and I don't understand why other people on this stage are more interested in protecting billionaires than investing in entire generations of Americans. I thought that was a very strong line, and I thought it was interesting how she put herself and Bernie separate to the other 10 on stage, which annoyed Amy Klobuchar so much. And anything that annoys Amy Klobuchar is surely a good thing.
And right before we go, David K. Johnston, you're a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Could you explain Joe Biden's comments on stockbrokers clipping coupons?
Well, in this country, if you own capital, your tax rate is much lower if you're in the top tier of Americans, and that's where you are if you own much capital, than if you're a working person. And he's exactly right that we are overtaxing work and we are undertaxing capital. And we absolutely need to tax these billionaires, many of whom don't just not pay taxes. Some of them literally turn a profit off the income tax system because of what are called deferral rules. And I'll have a book out in a little over a year proposing a whole new system that puts an end to that and makes everybody pay their taxes the same way workers do.
We're going to go to break, and then when we come back, Medicare for all. We have a doctor in the House, Dr. Steffi Woolhandler. We're talking to Mehdi Hasan, David K. Johnston, Kate Aronoff, and we're also going to speak with an immigrant rights leader about what wasn't talked about. Stay with us. Ramblin' by Ginger Baker Trio. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
As we continue to look at last night's Democratic debate, we turn now to the issue of health care. This is South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg speaking last night.
I don't think the American people are wrong when they say that what they want is a choice. And the choice of Medicare for all who want it, which is affordable for everyone because we make sure that the subsidies are in place, allows you to get that health care. It's just better than Medicare for all, whether you want it or not. And I don't understand why you believe the only way to deliver affordable coverage to everybody is to obliterate private plans, kicking 150 million Americans off of their insurance in 4 short years when we could achieve that same big, bold goal. And once again, we got to be president. We're competing to be president for the day after Trump. Our country will be horrifyingly polarized, even more than now. After everything we've been through, after everything we are about to go through, this country will be even more divided. Why unnecessarily divide this country over health care when there's a better way to deliver coverage for all?
Senator Sanders.
Well, as somebody who wrote the damn bill, as I said, let's be clear. Under the Medicare for all bill that I wrote, premiums are gone. Co-payments are gone. Deductibles are gone. All out-of-pocket expenses are gone. We're going to do better than the Canadians do, and that is what they have managed to do. At the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of people will save money on their health care bills. But I do think it is appropriate to acknowledge that taxes will go up. They're going to go up significantly for the wealthy. And for virtually everybody, the tax increase they pay will be substantially less than what they were paying for premiums and out-of-pocket expenses.
Well, Senator Warren, will you acknowledge what the senator just said about taxes going up?
So my view on this and what I have committed to is costs will go down for hardworking middle-class families. I will not embrace a plan like Medicare for all who can afford it. That will leave behind millions of people who cannot. And I will not embrace a plan that says people have great insurance right up until you get the diagnosis and the insurance company says, sorry, we're not covering your expensive cancer treatments. We're not covering your expensive treatments for MS. We're not covering what you need. I didn't spend most of my time in Washington. I spent most of my time studying one basic question, and that is why hardworking people go broke. And one of the principal reasons for that is the cost of health care. And back when I was studying it, 2 out of every 3 families that ended up in bankruptcy after a serious medical problem had health insurance. The problem we've got right now is the overall cost of health care. And look, you can try to spin this any way you want. I've spent my entire life on working on how America's middle class has been hollowed out and how we fight back. I've put out nearly 50 plans on how we can fight back and how we can rebuild an America that works. And a part of that is we've got to stop Americans from going bankrupt over health care.
Senator Klobuchar.
That was Senator Elizabeth Warren talking about the Medicare for All. The questioner was the New York Times national editor, Mark Lacey. Steffi Woolhandler, your response and the refusal of Elizabeth Warren to be pigeonholed by the question as to whether taxes would be raised.
Okay, well, I think the framing of that question is crazy. What really matters is how much the household is paying. And as Senator Sanders said, you're going to be paying so much less in premiums, copays, and deductibles that you're going to be paying less total for health care than you are today, right? You're going to be paying a little bit more taxes, but you're going to be paying less of those premiums and copays and deductibles. But overall, you're going to be better off financially. That's the correct framing. And to sit around and obsess about whether you pay that $3,000 as a tax or that $3,000 as a premium is the wrong framing. And that's really what Senator Warren was rejecting, in my opinion.
And that's how the media always frames it, the corporate media.
The corporate media is always framing it. And
that stops about every 5 or 6 or 7 minutes for a drug commercial.
Yeah, that's for sure. And, it's quite disingenuous because Pete Buttigieg and the health policy analysts of the world do understand that. They do know that people in other nations with single-payer Medicare for All pay a lot less for their health care than people do in the United States. But they use that little trick about talking about taxes as something horrible, but premiums, copays, and deductibles as something good. They use that trick to fool people.
And is it clear what Buttigieg means by Medicare for those who want it?
Well,
Medicare for all for those who want it?
Yes. It seems like he's endorsing a plan that goes by many names, Medicare Part E, Medicare Extra for All, which would involve large subsidies for people to purchase Medicare-like plan if they wanted it, but people in private insurance, because their employer purchased it, could stay in the private insurance. The problem with that is it's much more expensive than Medicare for All, because if you include private insurance, you're also including their massive overhead and profits, which average 12% of total premiums, often more. You're continuing to waste hundreds of billions of dollars every year in the excess administrative costs at doctors' offices and hospitals, because doctors and hospitals have to deal with multiple insurers. The whole idea of single-payer Medicare for All is you have a simple payment system. You can shrink that huge bureaucracy, health bureaucracy, save about $500 billion a year by shrinking that bureaucracy, and that $500 billion is the money you need to cover everyone and eliminate copayments and deductibles. And Buttigieg is saying, oh, well, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have private insurance. We can have their hundreds of billions of dollars of wasteful bureaucracy and overhead, and we're still going to be able to afford Medicare for All. That's simply not true.
Dr. Steffi Woolhandler, you were a big supporter of Bernie Sanders before, and now you were also a close ally of Elizabeth Warren. You're both professors at Harvard. She did use the term Medicare for all who can afford it. What does she mean?
Well, she was making fun of Buttigieg's proposal because the Medicare Extra plan, which I think he's talking about, requires people to continue to pay substantial premiums, co-payments, and deductibles, even though they get some subsidies. So she's just saying, and I think it's a correct point, that that with this Medicare Extra for All, it's so expensive, there's so much administrative waste that we're going to get less coverage at a higher cost than what we could get with Medicare for All.
And if you could quickly comment as a medical doctor on Bernie Sanders' heart attack. I mean, people were commenting. I mean, he looked so much better in this debate than the last one. He seemed like he had the flu in the last one, but wasn't actually admitting it. That's obviously separate completely from a heart attack.
Well, heart disease is not the death sentence it once was. Millions of people have heart attacks.
Cheney had like 6 of them.
Yeah, and many of them were walking down the street to 7th Avenue. We probably passed several of them on the way here to the studio. Some people get very sick immediately from their first heart attack. Some people have a very mild heart attack and go on for years and decades working hard and able to function. And fairly obviously, Senator Sanders was very well able to function last night. And to say that all of those millions of people with heart disease are disqualified from participation in politics is just discriminatory and unnecessary.
We're going to go to a break and then come back. We're talking about the 4th round of Democratic presidential primary debates that took place last night in Ohio. There were 12 candidates. Tom Steyer, the billionaire, was added to the mix. Stay with us. Music by Ainur. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as we continue coverage of the Democratic debate, let's turn to the issue of foreign policy. Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii pushed for ending what she called regime change wars in the Middle East.
Donald Trump has the blood of the Kurds on his hand, but so do many of the politicians in our country from both parties who have supported this ongoing regime change war in Syria that started in 2011, along with many in the mainstream media who have been championing and cheerleading this regime change war. As president, I will end these regime change wars by doing 2 things. Ending the draconian sanctions that are really a modern-day siege, the likes of which we are seeing Saudi Arabia wage against Yemen, that have caused tens and thousands of Syrian civilians to die and to starve. And I would make sure that we stop supporting terrorists like al-Qaeda in Syria, who've been the ground force in this ongoing regime change war. I'd like to ask Senator Warren if she would join me in calling for an end to this regime change war in Syria, finally.
So, look, I think that we ought to get out of the Middle East. I don't think we should have troops in the Middle East. But we have to do it the right way, the smart way. What this president has done is that he has sucked up to dictators. He has made impulsive decisions that often his own team doesn't understand. He has cut and run on our allies, and he has enriched himself at the expense of the United States of America. In Syria, he has created a bigger than ever humanitarian crisis. He has helped ISIS get another foothold, a new lease on life.
That was Elizabeth Warren, and before that, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Mehdi Hasan, your response to this exchange briefly.
Yep. So Elizabeth Warren there saying she wanted troops out of the Middle East. My ears perked up as I was watching the debate. Was a U.S. presidential candidate really saying they were going to pull all U.S. troops out of the Middle East? That would be unprecedented. The Warren campaign have since clarified that she was referring to combat troops specifically in Syria, that she's in favor of withdrawing but wants it to be done in the appropriate way, which is the Bernie Sanders position as well. You have a responsible withdrawal. You don't cut and run. You don't abandon the Kurds via tweet over a weekend without telling your commanders on the ground. So that's what she was referring to. Obviously, Tulsi Gabbard was trying to get her to go further. Gabbard is a fascinating character, very controversial figure. Some on the left like her. They see her as an anti-war figure. Yesterday's debate, she was both half right and half wrong. She was right to say that too many Democrats and too many people in D.C. Did support a lot of Syrian rebel groups, many of whom are now the same Syrian rebel groups backed by Turkey who are slaughtering Kurds. And that's a fact. She's wrong to say that those Kurds are dying because of a regime change war. U.S. troops in Syria were there with those Kurds fighting ISIS, not fighting Assad. So she's wrong about that. And, of course, she's the wrong messenger. As much as I'd like to see more Democratic candidates oppose endless wars in the Middle East, Tulsi Gabbard is someone who said herself that she is a hawk when it comes to the war on terror. She's only a dove on regime change wars, but she's happy for Russia or Assad or even the US to bomb any group it deems to be al-Qaeda. She's also a candidate who has some very dodgy ties to fascist leaders like President Assad in Syria, President Sisi in Egypt, and of course neo-fascists like Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India. So she's not the right messenger, to be honest. But yes, we do need to be talking much more about endless wars in the Middle East. As I said at the start of the show, I'm glad we talked about Trump's mess up in Syria and his abandonment of the Kurds, but we didn't talk last night about Yemen, where Bernie Sanders led the Senate in opposition to U.S. involvement in that horrific war, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We didn't talk about Israel-Palestine. We didn't talk about China at all in the debate last night. So the foreign policy part of the debate was, as usual, lacking.
We're going to go to another issue that wasn't talked about. Well, it was raised by one of the candidates, former HUD Secretary Julian Castro.
I also want people to think the folks this week that saw those images of ISIS prisoners running free, to think about how absurd it is that this president is caging kids on the border and effectively letting ISIS prisoners run free.
So I'd like to bring in Marilena Incapié into this conversation, Executive Director of the National Immigration Law Center. She's speaking to us from Montgomery, Alabama. Marilena, we booked you early to talk about all the issues that would be raised around immigration. I'm playing one of the candidates, Julian Castro, not one of the questioners, the moderators on the issue of immigration, because there was no question. If you can talk about the fact that this was a 3-hour debate without a question on immigration.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Yes, I mean, completely agree with Mehdi and Kay, who earlier mentioned, right? We're talking about defining issues of our time, immigration, climate change, so many others that weren't raised. And the New York Times and CNN, frankly, missed an important opportunity on the very day of the debate, October 15th. One of the Trump administration's signature policy changes, the public charge rule, was scheduled to go into effect yesterday, affecting 26 million people in the nation. This is a radical reform to our legal immigration system. And fortunately, we've been successful in blocking it in the courts. Just last Friday, we had about 4 different courts, federal courts, that have temporarily blocked the administration from implementing this. But this was a major gap in a 3-hour debate, as you just mentioned. We expect much more, not just from the media, but also from the candidates.
And on the issue of the latest news, the Border Wars book that's coming out from the 2 New York Times reporters that raised President Trump in the White House, pushing for migrants to be shot. When his staff told him that would be illegal, sir, he said, well, what about just shooting them in the legs? They said that, too, would be illegal. And then his push for moats along border wall filled with alligators and snakes.
Yeah, I mean, it is every single day, Amy, we are hearing new developments from this administration, from this president who believes he is above the law, who is governing based on fear and chaos, and frankly, dehumanizing and criminalizing immigrants. And it's not just folks who are here undocumented. It's people who are seeking asylum and refugee status in our nation. It is people who are long-term residents, people who are losing their immigration status, right? Whether it's young immigrants like DACA recipients or people with temporary protected status who've been here for 10, 15, 20-plus years. So again, the fact that there was a 3-hour debate with no questions about this could have been part of the foreign policy questions. It could have been part of the health care conversation about the future of labor. Immigrants and immigration issues affect all parts of our society. And Donald Trump is running on it. He knows this is his signature issue. He knows it will rile up his base. And Democrats cannot continue to simply be afraid to lean into this issue. They can't be simply anti-Trump. They actually need to be pro-America and share what their vision is for a 21st century immigration policy in our nation.
And Kate, talking about an issue, again, that was not discussed at all by the questioners, the issue of climate change. We've got about a minute left. Your sense of the continued failure of the media to deal with this as a pressing and a key issue of this presidential race.
Sure. I mean, I think the cable news networks just have a pitiful record on this, right? They don't cover climate change. They only bring it up when it's the most convenient for them. They take money from corporate advertisers. The last post-debate show, the last debate was sponsored by BP, for instance. This is totally absurd. And again, a missed opportunity, right? Because we have, we have issues like immigration and climate change, which are so interconnected, and to just ignore all of them, or to pretend that this isn't sort of what the 21st century is going to be about, and talk about electability is just absurd. And I think, we need to have a real discussion about whether these networks are responsible hosts for these debates.
I mean, and the fact that Bernie Sanders is coming back strong, large rally in Queens, AOC is going to be there, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar just endorsed him, Rashida Tlaib is reportedly going to endorse him, the significance of the AOC endorsement, all three, the squad, except for Ayanna Pressley at this point.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, Bernie Sanders' critics have spent years trying to smear him and his supporters as just representing sort of white, male voters. And I think that's a very hard argument to make when you have three women of color who are endorsing him because they trust him to build a multiracial working class Democratic Party. And that is the party that they want to fight for, and that they think, he is the best, ally to help build. So I think that's, it's an incredible win for the Sanders campaign.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. Journalist Kate Aronoff, Dr. Steffi Wohlhandler of Physicians for National Health Program, The Intercept's Mehdi Hassan speaking to us from Washington, and Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter David K. Johnston, founder and editor of DCReport.org, as well as from Montgomery, Alabama, Marilena Incapié, Executive Director of National Immigration Law Center. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.